This is part four of our conversation about intellectual property, and we continue with copyright. Some of the material in this segment is very squishy, and some of it is very solid. And so I'll ask you to bear with me because this is also probably the longest segment, but I didn't really see a good way to break it down. Of course, the nice thing about it is that you can stop and start as much often as you wish to, but this one will go on quite a while, or it will certainly seem to go on quite a while. Um, Again, dipping back into history, this notion of people having ownership of their creative products started 300 years ago. And the idea was that artists had patrons, and including the governing authorities, and the idea of giving uh, rights to certain properties would be that kind of a two-way deal. The creators would get say over their work as long as the work that they did was pleasing to their patrons or to the governing authorities. And so it really kind of started out as a control mechanism, but then, and it's a longer conversation that we don't really need to get into, but the role actually reversed, and actually this became a source of people power, and kind of diminished the power of the government, because people, once they had the authority to own their creative products, then they didn't really look to the government as much. So time passed, and then they founded the United States of America, and they said, "Well, we need some kind of a rule book," as we talked about in chapter one, and they said our basic law is going to be the U.S. Constitution, which was adopted in 1789. And in that Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, the specific authority for people to own their creative uh, products was granted. So it's part of the basic law of the country to have patent and copyright. And the clause 7 actually says to promote the progress of science and useful arts. So they're saying the reason why we're doing this is to promote in innovation. And so that was done by securing for a limited time to the authors, inventors, the creatives, the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Now, even today, these patent and copyright apply for are limited to specific times. And the reason for that is it's still in the basic law that there has to be a time when the copyright interest ends. And the idea there is to just keep the creative engine flowing. Um, the question that arises was, well, who owns the copyright? And of course, the natural answer would be the person who created it. And very important to you as a media practitioner is that there are cases or there are situations in which the person whose mind created the content or created the product is not the owner. This is called a work made for hire. So the entity commissioning a work um, actually owns the copyright. This can be really important to you if you're working in a creative capacity for an employer. If you think about the person who, like, said, "Let's use this swoosh," or "How about we at the keyboard company? How about we use elves in our commercial?" Um, if there was no other agreement, then the copyright to the elf, the copyright to the swoosh belongs entirely to the employer, um, because it's a work made for hire. If you go to work one day and you come up with a really creative thing uh, that's subject to you copywriting it, but you're on the clock, you're being paid, then technically the copyright doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the person who's paying you. Um, the nice thing about this is that all conditions of employment are negotiable, so that a person who goes to work as a photojournalist for a television station happens to capture an image that has market value, they can negotiate with their employer that even though they were using company equipment and may have even been on company time, that they would have the copyright to that. So basically, you remember that there's this duality that exists out there. Is that the default, of course, is the person whose brain created the work owns the copyright, but there are plenty of situations in which a person is being paid or has been commissioned to be creative, and in that case, the law says the default rule would be that the copyright belongs to the person who commissioned the work, and that's called a work made for hire. And I'm spending a lot of time on it because you folks are creative, and you need to be very aware of who owns the copyright to your work. In black letter law, following up on the constitutional provision, the Copyright Act was last completely redone in 1976. And that wording of that act is what controls decisions about copyright today. Long after you're out of this course and you forget some of the little details or you need a refresher, you can always go to copyright.gov, and there's a wonderful set of FAQs there where you can find out the ins and outs of copyright in a specific situation. Initially, the time limit was 14 years. Congress initially said that not only was a person's creative content owned by them for 14 years before it went into the public domain, it could be renewed for another 14. Then not long after that, actually, about 40 years later, they changed it to a 28-year period, and it still could be renewed for another 14 years. Lobbyists have been very busy in recent years, and we shall see why. But the current rule is that once a copyright is created, the copyright lasts until for the life of the last living author, in case there's more than one author. But if there's one author, the copyright expires 70 years after the copyright owner dies. So it can last a really long time. If you copyright something when you're 20 years old and you live to be 90, that's 70 years. And then after you've gone to the next level, it can ask another 70 years. So, or it will last another 70 years. So something that's copyrighted today by a 20-year-old, technically, the copyright could last for 140 years. Sometimes, more than one person has created something. They've created something in partnership, and then you go by the last person to die and add 70 years. For works made for hire, there's just a flat 95 years for the duration of the copyright. So why do we care about how long this is lasting? Well, there are a lot of really valuable copyrights out there, and corporations have invested great amounts of funds in it. And the notion that Nike would no longer own the swoosh after 14 years is just, is unthinkable. And then, of course, there's the mouse. The market estimate for Mickey Mouse and associated Mickey Mouse products is about $3 billion. Well, Walt Disney created Mickey Mouse in 1928, and Disney representatives lobbied very heavily and got extensions, and the law changed. And other people did too, who owned valuable copyrights. They didn't want to see these things go into the public domain. So under the present rules, Disney owns the copyright until January the 1st, 2024. And then anybody that wants to put a Mickey Mouse watch or a Mickey Mouse t-shirt or Mickey Mouse whatever can copy this and it will not be an infringement of Disney's rights. Now, Disney will retain some rights, but we're not going to go into that. Basically, the deal is that these copyrights are very valuable. I mean, the Disney empire is built on that mouse, and the ownership and the protection of the copyright and of that has been very important to the corporation since Mickey was first drawn in 1928, and losing it is going to be a significant thing. Of course, the law could change again after that. Next, we turn to the issue of, well, okay, I own this copyright. What does it mean? Well, we already know that it means you can control, you own it, it's yours. It's like that baseball we talked about, back in the second slide. You can give it away, you can sell it, you can decide who's going to play with it, and copyright works exactly the same. If you own a copyright, you have the control over reproduction of the work. If it's a story or a book or a play or a song or something like that, you are entitled to control and derive revenue from reproduction of the work. Derivative works we'll talk about more in just a minute, but a derivative work is one that's very closely associated with the copyrighted work. And again, we'll talk about that more in just a second. Distribution of the work means where, mostly in terms of geography. If you happen to not like Italy and you don't want your copyrighted work distributed in Italy, that's fine. So this can be used anywhere in the world except Italy. It's okay. And then performance or display of the work. Distribution of the work these are just the rights that are associated with, I own a copyright, so what powers do I have related to my copyrighted work? A problem in the internet age is, of course, that the internet does not know any political boundaries. A person in Sudan might decide to make Mickey Mouse t-shirts, and I don't know what Sudanese law is, but it's certainly a person in Sudan or Myanmar or anywhere else outside of the United States is not answerable to U.S. copyright law. So, what do you do? Well, there's one thing that the United States was initially very hostile to, but in 1980 did join. It's called the Berne Convention, which is kind of an international agreement that says if you enforce our copyright laws in your country, we will enforce your copyright laws in our country. It's kind of a trade deal. It's still very problematic, of course. It's not really easy to find out who is making Mickey Mouse t-shirts in Sudan or who is putting the swoosh on products in Tokyo. But if you find out, then theoretically the courts in Sudan and the courts in Japan are supposed to use U.S. copyright law to put a stop to that. As I said, we would talk about derivative a little bit more, and it's usually a fact question. And this is part of the rule that's the copyright conversation today that's a little squishy, because you have to look to the actual what's going on to decide whether something is a derivative use, which means it borrows too heavily from the original copyrighted work and constitutes an infringement, or whether it's a transformative work. In other words, it's so different from the original that it is not an infringement on the copyright. And again, this is one that's not always easy to determine. There's no infringement about the Mamas and the Papas, sang a song about rainy days and Mondays. But that doesn't mean that nobody else can ever write a song about rainy days and Mondays. The ideas are not copyrightable. General concepts are not copyrightable. But then again, if you created a new sitcom with a deputy sheriff who's kind of a bumbler and a sheriff who doesn't carry a gun and somebody who's like Aunt Bee and somebody else who's like the town drunk, then the people who own the copyright to the Andy Griffith Show might say, hey, that's a derivative work. And that's what you have juries for. And that's why a jury would look and say, you know, this is a transformative work. It's a completely different show. And, or they might say, no, you copied this thing, and that makes it a derivative work. Again, you know, there's so many plot lines in the world. I mean, we all have seen shows, you know, like the typical one where uh, the girl's best friends with a boy, and her heart is telling her that this guy, other guy, is the person she has to be in love with, and the friend stays with her no matter what, and then eventually they find out that the guy she was going for was a creep, and that the guy that had been her friend all along was really should be her true love. I mean, how many? I mean, that's Romeo and Juliet. I mean, there's any number of plots that are just the same. It's kind of like Gilligan's Island back in the 1960s. You know, every show was they almost get off the island and they don't get off the island, and you know, and certainly if you look at two very successful franchises, Star Trek and Star Wars. You know, you've got similar things that's going on in outer space. You got heroic people. You've got dastardly enemies who are trying to conquer the universe. So you've got the same basic ideas, some of the same character types, but it's a transformative work. It's not so heavily dependent on they're not so heavily dependent on each other that one can say, oh no, we've already made that movie, and so you're violating my copyright. Again, this tends to be a little squishy. One of the areas where there's just a lot of litigation is music. If you Google up a song by the Chiffons from, I guess, the 1950s, it's called "He's So Fine," and then you Google up George Harrison playing "My Sweet Lord," you'll see that they sound very similar. And Harrison, who was a member of the Beatles, eventually paid for the infringement. He said that he may have heard "He's So Fine" and he may have internalized it. He may have unintentionally used the same melody, and he said he didn't do it on purpose, which was fine. But the case was eventually settled as an infringement case. But then you take Robin Thicke. Was sued by the estate of Marvin Gaye over a song called "Got to Give It Up," and the jury said, no, this is a completely different work. So there's just a lot of litigation about music, and because there's only 8 keys, so how many melodies are there? Another interesting case is the Garcia Ferry case. When President Obama, former President Obama, was running for office, the Associated Press photographer named Garcia took this photo. Incidentally, it was probably a work made for hire because Garcia didn't take it off the clock. He took it while he was on duty for the Associated Press, the photo on the left. So that Garcia, unless he had some other arrangement with AP, didn't own the copyright to it, although he took the picture. The Associated Press owned the copyright. But lo and behold, after a few weeks after this photograph was published, this campaign poster showed up. And Garcia and the Associated Press were somewhat aggrieved. They said, wait a minute, that's our photograph. We own the copyright to that. And the artist, Ferry, said, no, this is a transformative work. It's so different from the original that it can't be seen to be an infringement on your copyright. It was so substantially changed that, in essence, the idea was taken, but not the photograph. And of course, Garcia argued the opposite. So how did it come out? We don't really know. The case was settled out of court between the Associated Press and the artist, and we don't really know the outcome. We do know, obviously, that Photoshop is a very powerful tool, and that we should be very careful when we use it. That if you find a photograph that you really like and you do a lot of stuff to it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a new photograph. If it's too close to the original, it would be an infringement on the original owner's copyright. Now we do have, even though that's a sliding scale on transformative and derivative, a lot of times we do have some rules. For one, just taking out parts of an original work does not constitute creating a new work. This comes up a lot in the context of music and performances and other things. Deleting certain portions and say, well, I didn't. That makes it a new work. It doesn't. But again, a new movie with essentially the same plot will be considered to be original work. There are just not that many plot lines out there. A smart guy stumbles upon a crime, and this expert is brought in to solve it, and solves the crime, and turns out to be who and whatever. There's just whodunit books and everything like that all have essentially the same plot, but they're all original works. So the other element is distribution. This basically comes into things like where a copyrighted product is offered for sale, and it's totally under the control of the copyright owner and their preference or by strategy as to where their copyrighted works appear or are performed. And for performance, it's who can sing my song. If whoever owns the copyright to Sweet Caroline doesn't like Ole Miss, then they say you can't play my song, or you can't play the song we own at your sporting events, and we couldn't do it. But otherwise, we can. Again, you think of a copyright just like you think of real property. The same terms and conditions that apply to real property apply to copyrighted property. And the person who owns the copyright, or the company that owns the copyright, has these plenary type authorities over who can do it. In this next portion, we turn to analysis when an infringement claim is made. When somebody says, hey, I own the copyright to that, what are the steps that you go through to determine whether there has or has not been an infringement? And it's a methodical thing, and if you kind of get your brain wrapped around it, it'll help you. So say A tells B, you violated my copyright. Well, the first question is whether the material in question is subject to copyright in the first place. Okay, and again, we have our list from a couple of lectures ago, which like names and formulas and facts and other things that are just not subject to copyright. So somebody says they have a copyright, first you check to see if what they claim to have the copyright on is subject to being copyrighted in the first place. The second thing that you go through would be to test for originality. Is this a knockoff, or is it a really truly original work? Have I copied too much, or have I created something that's similar but substantially different enough to be transformative? The third question you ask is, has the copyright expired? Again, in today's world, that would be, pretty rare, because something from like the, 70 years ago could be still under copyright. And then we turn to another consideration, and that would be the statutory exceptions, or what's called fair use. And fair use is something that we'll talk about. First, let's distinguish plagiarism. When a person tries to pass off someone else's work as their work, then that person has plagiarized. They're basically cheating. They're saying, I created this when they didn't. That's plagiarism. A person who uses the copyrighted material of somebody else may or may not be saying, I created this, but they have stolen property. that belongs to somebody else. So there's a difference between plagiarism, which is claiming to have created something you didn't create, and copyright infringement, which is theft. It's taking something that belonged to somebody else, and whether you said you created it or not doesn't matter. It, it doesn't help at all. It's still a theft. I used the example in class of sometime of a guy who goes on one of the square banks on the square, when there were banks on the square, and says, this is a stick up, and takes all the money, and then goes across to Yaya's and says, I'd like some yogurt, and by the way, I stole this money. You know, the fact that they admitted that it's not their money doesn't mean anything. It's just strangeness. Now, fair use is sometimes, again, kind of like the difference between transformative and derivative, because it's a policy. And basically, what the courts have said in this things is that there are circumstances in which copyrighted content may be used without permission or payment, and it's not going to be considered to be an infringement. The definition is that it's a rule of reason to balance the author's right to compensation for his work on the one hand against the public's interest in the widest possible dissemination of ideas and information on the other. And money kind of comes back into the picture here a little bit. So how does fair use apply in day-to-day life? Well, one thing, it's okay just to quote from copyrighted material. If I quote a line from a Robert Frost poem to you, and I say, you know, as Robert Frost said in this poem, and I read a verse to you, you know, that he owns that, and he has control over who should be able to use that. But it's like a de minimis exception. You're just quoting from it. The statutory exceptions include use for educational purposes, and which we've talked about a good deal, and to comment or criticize, or for parody. And remember, of course, that a lot of times people will claim to have copyrighted something when they're facts, and you cannot copyright a fact. So, in effect, what you do here is go through a same type of four-step analysis. When you're trying to decide whether use of copyrighted material is a fair use, therefore not an infringement, you look at, you know, why this person was using it. That's the first question. What was the purpose or the character of the use? What type of work it was is a factor. The amount and substantiality of the whole copyrighted work in relation to the amount borrowed is examined. And again, and we said value doesn't matter in law, but sometimes it kind of sneaks in the back door. And the more egregious examples of what's not going to be fair use is if it deprives the copyright owner of a potential market for the copyrighted work. Okay. Now, we've all had television on and seen news commentators or comedy shows or whatever that have used clips from other shows. Well, those clips are copyrighted. If you look on YouTube, you know, they're compilations of bloopers from Seinfeld, or funny things said during weather forecasts on commercial stations, where all of those things are copyrighted. And technically, a person would need to obtain permission of the owner of the material in order to use it. But in these cases, a lot of times it's fair use because the purpose is content or comment or criticism. So you see a compilation like that, and you think, well, did this person who made this compilation get permission from all of the like, if it's a compilation of the best football plays of the year, Did they get permission from all that? Well, no, not if they play it and comment about this is a really good play or this was not a good play. So when the permission is comment or criticism, that falls under the umbrella of fair use. Another example would be like photocopying a magazine article to send to a friend, or cutting and pasting a photograph, article, or sending it to a friend. Now, obviously, a link is just kind of a directing the person toward copyrighted material. It's not actually taking the material. But where you would get in trouble would be to reproduce the whole magazine and start selling it. That's definitely not going to be a fair use. So you have, again, this kind of sliding scale. Is this just a minor type of infringement? Is it being used for educational purposes? Is it being used for for humor, to make fun of it, to comment on it, to criticize it? In that case, that promotes conversation when conversation is good in America. But if you look toward the monetary side of things, where you're depriving a person of revenue, then it is definitely not a fair use. Again, and as the slide said, you always look to the purpose. Suppose Bob cut and pasted an entire copyrighted news article on his blog without permission of whoever owns the copyright to the news article. And we're not talking about the facts in the article because those can't be copyrighted. We're talking about the presentation of information which can be copyrighted. And Bob puts this on his blog and then goes through paragraph by paragraph and point by point, inserts his own thoughts. Well, if he had just left it as something that he cut and pasted on his site, then that's a copyright violation. But once he goes through and comments on it, criticizes it, evaluates it, says this part's good, this part's not good, then it is would be deemed to be a fair use. And see, overall, what the fair use rule does is it keeps copyright law from inhibiting conversation. That just because somebody owns the rights to a presentation, that other people can't talk about it, other people can't excerpt it. And if that was the law, if copyright law didn't have the fair use exception, then you'd have to have permission every time you quoted somebody else, basically, especially if the quotes were written down. But the big hint here, of course, is to remember that everything's negotiable, and that you follow the money. Suppose Bob has a brainstorm and he finds that there's this new celebrity, and he cuts and pastes content from all over the internet to create an aggregate site about this celebrity for one-stop shopping for the fans, and sells ads on the site. Well, that's likely going to be an infringement. Links to to the articles and photos and whatever about the celebrity would probably be okay. But once you actually cut and paste the photograph and put it on an aggregate site, start making money out of it, then it's going to be problematic. Less common things in this area is to look to see whether a work is still available or if it's out of print, and also to look at whether the alleged copyright is on a consumable, which is something actively being sold in the marketplace, or whether the work is really artistic or creative, which gets a higher kind of degree of protection, like a painting or a photograph or a play or a song, or whether it's like a book that contains the history of Sasquatch. If it's more informational, more factual, more historical type book, it's not that big of a deal. Now, if your brain is not hurting at this point, it will be hurting a little bit now, because what you see going on now is, especially in marketing, is that magazines will have Facebook pages, and television to some extent, will have streaming content and not include the commercials, or will actually use a social media platform um, to get information to viewers live. Well, the reality here is that what Facebook and other social media platforms sell is eyes and ears. So what they're doing is sending viewers to their competition. The idea is that the magazine is going to brand itself and do well co-branding, uh, get people to buy the magazine by having a social media thing. But the reality is that there's this symbiosis that's going on, that Facebook is actually allowing people to post copyrighted material, and the people who own the copyrighted material don't really care because they're trying to increase their audience, but at the same time they're increasing Facebook's audience. So there are a lot of in and out, back and forth. Calming down a little bit and wrapping this up, even after 35 minutes and 38 seconds. Some nuts and bolts, things that we can be more definite about. One thing is the rules about the effectiveness of copyright, and I think we talked about this initially, and we can continue looking at it. But once a work is copyrighted, when the fingers leave the keyboard, when the shutter clicks, when the the pen is lifted from the paper, that moment, whatever is done is copyrighted to the person who created it. Um, it's the magic. Even works in progress. I'm writing a 6-chapter book. I've only written 2 chapters. Well, those 2 chapters are copyrighted. Um, if you want to add copyright 2021, that's okay. That gives notice to people that you intend to enforce your copyright, but it has no other legal effect. Copyrights can be registered with the U.S. government through an online process for $35 or $45 by mail, and the instructions for how to do this are on the internet. A copyright notice would look like this, and specifically, all rights reserved means that's kind of the default position, is that if you're going to use this material, then this is who you contact, because this is the person who owns the copyright. Again, as we saw from our stadium example where we talked about, intellectual property at a football game, everything's negotiable. Anything the parties agree to is okay, unless it's illegal, like selling heroin or something like that. But the law is the default position. So a copyright owner can sell all, part, borrow, charge a lot, charge a little, give this to so and so and not to so and so, whatever. When I was a syndicated columnist, I had the copyright to my words, and what I gave to the people who paid me to publish the columns was one-time rights plus internet. They didn't have serial rights or North American serial. It wasn't necessary. We just negotiated. Here's the deal: what I send you, you can print it one time and you can put it on your website, and that was our deal. You know. We turn now to the issue of damages. So my copyright has been taken. Just like my baseball has been taken. What are my damages? Well, the value of the baseball. And the same kind of thing applies to damages in copyright. If a copyright owner can prove dollar damages to some degree of certainty, a court can award that amount to make the person whose material was stolen whole. Sometimes it's very difficult to come up with a dollars and cents figure, and the statutes are awarded. There are statutory amounts in copyright law that specify starting at $200 and ranging upwards. Okay, this has been a 40-minute presentation, and I hope you stopped a couple of times along the way. Some of it was very hard and fast, so you can look for test questions to be geared toward the areas of copyright law that are definite. And I certainly would not do anything that required you to engage in any guesswork, like give you two plots and tell you whether one is original and the other is derivative or something like that, because those are kind of driven by the specific facts of every case. Okay, all we have left is part 5, and the nice part about that is that it is very short.